gonna tell you something. If you two never bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving them pension. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there fucking say, well, he's the boss, you have to do his stuff. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is that the boss is your boss.
My money at this point. So we told you that Joe Bruno was a beloved character. And anytime he did travel into Philadelphia, which was insanely rare, people would come to see him and they would flock to see him. He was like the John Gotti of sorts before John Gotti. And in the streets, Bruno was a feared guy and he was a respected guy. And the fact that he never acted like an arrogant prick or an arrogant boss helped him a great deal. And we mentioned that Bruno helped his underlings, especially when they got into a legal jam. And nobody prospered more from Bruno's help than a guy by the name of Angelo Anellaro, who would become Angelo Bruno. Angelo Bruno, as a soldier in Cosa Nostra, had a number of arrests during Joe Bruno's tenure, which added to his overall criminal record. That had some guilty pleas, some acquittals, but did nonetheless dab a little bit more color into his character portrait of being in the mafia. And in 1937, Angelo was arrested for disorderly conduct at Castor and Erie Avenues in North Philadelphia, to which he paid a $10 fine and costs. Then in 1940, Angelo was charged with setting up and maintaining a lottery of 50,000 number plays and was found guilty. His cousin from Trenton, Johnny Keys Simone, was also involved in that, as well as Joe Bruno. Simone was running Atlas Sanitation Services from Trenton and was arrested on suspicion. He told police that he lived in Philadelphia, giving the address of another mob member 3 years later in the same case. Joe Lagana, who was pretty much a clean-cut gangster who laid the background of active family matters, federal law enforcement noticed that Simone went every month to Trenton's police department to remove roaches from certain sections of the police department, and he was accompanied by none other than Sam DeCavalcante, who would later become intertwined and implicated with Angelo Bruno in an early FBI organized crime sting operation. So Atlas Sanitation dealt with picking up rodents and stuff like that, but it's just kind of funny that Cavalcante and Lagana and Simone go every month to a particular place at the Trenton Police Department where nobody knows. And I think they were given intel and payoffs and stuff like that. Anyway, the Philadelphia police and detectives added more arrests to Angelo Bruno's rap sheet in 1944, which showed his expansion in his criminal career. When arrested at his home on South Broad Street, police would cite Bruno for receiving stolen goods in violation of the Witkin Firearm Act. Local beat cops found Silver Fox furs and a snub-nosed loaded .38 in Bruno's dresser drawer. He would be arrested, arraigned, and charged, but would be found not guilty. That same year, the FBI would note that Angelo Bruno was a fully inducted member into the Matteo Mafia, engaged in illegal liquor trafficking and the handling of prostitutes. The information being given to the police and the FBI was basically misinformation because Bruno was more mainly involved with Matteo and baseball bookmaking, and he actually had a location off 7th and Morris. But we're going to save all the Angelo Bruno stuff for later down the line, but these are just sort of little tidbits I wanted to mention along the way. Excuse me. So the 1940s weren't very friendly to the Bruno crime family. A lot of the guys in the family would take in pinches for gambling rackets, but the important thing was that they were small charges and they weren't violent charges. If there were violent charges attached, the mob would just pay off the cops and the judge, and those charges often drifted away out of sight. It was Joe Bruno's influence and power which spread out, which ultimately would lead to politics and politicians. And that was truly Joe Bruno's interest, making political inroads. Bruno was also not dependent on friendships back in New York. Salvatore Sabella was utterly dependent on his friendships back in New York. And that was one of the major differences. Sabella also needed New York gangsters to help him with law enforcement, with charges and politicians. Avena, by contrast, had even less power than Sabella. Joe Bruno on his own, with his own power, was able to accomplish a lot of different things. He was also different, in terms of interstate conglomerates, meaning that he would meet with other crime families outside of his own areas. That's a little different than the others. He was also smart enough to spread the money around to politicians and law enforcement outside of his state as well. And he would form friendships and associations in all three levels of the federal government. Bruno knew when to be a gangster, and he knew when to be a business politician. Joe Ida, a fellow mobster in Philadelphia, would move out of South Philadelphia and move to New Brunswick near Bruno. Ida was close to Bruno, and the two had a lot of businesses together. Their friendship was a tight bond, and that bond really spoke volumes because Ida was not Sicilian and represented an element within a faction of Avena's family that often caused or led to cultural bigotry, Calabrese versus Sicilian, etc. And Ida was Calabrian. And he was close with other Calabrese in South Philly like Joe Ragnetta, Marco Reginelli, the Piccolos, Joe Lagana, and others. They were all associates under the reign of Sabella during Prohibition, and like I said a dozen shows ago, it wasn't until 1931 Luciano changed the rules that non-Sicilians gained entrance into the families and became essentially what we know as made men. So when Bruno and Ida were coming up, they weren't considered anything other than just connected guys. The friendship between the two was a good political move, and it bridged gaps where old world bosses couldn't bridge them. Bruno, with his contacts back in Washington, D.C., didn't focus on the Naval Yard in Philadelphia, which a lot of people believe was a mistake. Like, you should focus on that. But Bruno focused his interests in construction, putting together $1 million deals and moving into control all of the waste industries, controlling the Northeast PA and Southeast PA. But it wasn't just that. But he also wanted to expand that operation. This was a guy that was focused on just expanding in every direction. Guys like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky and Vito Genovese and Luciano were always being surveilled. They were always being harassed by law enforcement, but Bruno was able to avoid every single bit of that. And a lot of that has to do with staying the fuck out of South Philadelphia and being absent from being seen day to day working with the mob. He was just a smart guy. He insulated himself well, which is something that we can't say about every boss that's ever been a boss in history. And the feds, who always typically look to, into the money of bosses, could never find a dime. And Bruno wasn't a poor guy, but he wasn't wealthy either. And that's largely because he was a fucking degenerate gambler. But he had a few homes. His children and grandchildren wanted for nothing. And that was all he was content with. He didn't need to be wealthy. He wasn't a greedy guy. And Bruno was such a fucking degenerate that he knew the mob owned jockeys and controlled the outcome. And Harry Riccobene would tell him not to bet on that horse because we don't control the jockey, or we control the jockey and he's going to lose. But fucking Bruno wouldn't listen. And he would lose and lose bad. He would tell him, don't bet on this horse because we're going to pull this horse back. He'd still bet on the fucking horse anyway. To him, it was just the action, the excitement of the race. Riccobene, decades later, would tell the FBI that in those days, they were fixing horse races. Certain jockeys would come together and they would pit mobster against mobster in races to raise the stakes or to raise their payments. Pretty smart move. And Bruno's love of horses and racing, he purchased a ton of horses, but they were all losers. But Bruno didn't give a shit. To him, it was just something to do, something he enjoyed, and it was far and away from those early days of murder and mayhem. In the summer of 1946, Bruno begins to slow down a little bit. He was tired, and he begins to have a couple of health issues. At first, it was age, and then he realized that he was just slowing down in general. Doctors warned him about a lot of things, but he just waved his hand and told them, don't worry, I'm fine. In October of that year, he was in New York and not really feeling well. He would check himself into New York City Hospital, and a few days after entering, he would be dead at the age of 57 of heart failure. His funeral was a big event, 400 floral pieces, 150 cars followed his hearse to the grave. What Joe Bruno had done was decentralize his role while he allowed his members to control the streets, and he focused on non-violent means to make money. His choice of a Machiavellian structure and using politicians to the point of creating an entirely new mafia in Philadelphia, those were his calling cards. His moves were similar to those in the early days of Tammany Hall here in New York City. He formed his own mob with his own views, and he stayed in control even with those fucking Lanzettis running around creating havoc everywhere. He was able to keep friendships with the Jewish mob where Avena and Sabella refused to even do business with them. What he created allowed those behind him to have the blueprint on how to succeed. And we're not going to jump into Angelo Bruno today, like I said, because we are going to begin that next week. But I wanted to talk about Narcotics for a minute. And we're going to talk about the Jewish mob, too, because we need to talk about how narcotics became a staple of the mafia. So, for instance, hypodermic needles at one time were made out of metal. It made them heavy and made it difficult for a junkie to handle back in the early 1900s. And in those days, you didn't even have to find a vein. In those days, all you had to do was just put it in your arm and the rest is history. And when Harry Riccobene was asked in the early days of narcotics dealing, Riccobene would say that nobody really talked about it because it was considered like alcohol. And most who were into bootlegging were also slightly into narcotics dealing. And in the early days, according to Riccobene, the mafia had no real interest in Philadelphia in selling it mainstream, meaning they didn't want bulk. But it wasn't hard to acquire, but it was expensive. And so the correlation from the mafia to drugs, because from a financial aspect, it was just a lot of money. Mob guys would lend money to drug dealers to purchase massive amounts of drugs. And that was the mob's initial standing on it. They were the financiers of the drug trade, nothing more, nothing less. And as the demand for it grew, the mob began to have sort of a different viewpoint of it. In those days, cokeheads, heroin junkies were viewed a lot like the town drunk. And people just saw it as another bad vice that people had. And keep in mind, this is 70 years before the mob organized narcotics operations. 70 years before. Going back to 1848, Philadelphia is one of 6 ports within the United States that was importing opium. And the federal drug import law, which was the early effort to say that narcotics were bad and, antisocial and in the wrong hands could kill people. In Philadelphia, opium had 2 main purposes. It was used as an anesthetic within the medical industry or for drug addicts. What started as a slow sort of thing saw a great increase by 1870 in Smyrna. Customs reported in 1870 that they noted 254,609 pounds of opium was imported into Philadelphia. By 1880, it rose to 533,451 pounds. At the same exact time, the Chinese had opened opium dens in South Philadelphia. Eventually, it became not just a Chinese-owned business, but it became widespread in tenderloin districts in the North and South Philadelphia. Along with opium, morphine ran directly next to it. Doctors began treating it, using it to treat wounded soldiers and for different things. If your kid had ADHD and was going bonkers off candy, they'd give him a little morphine. That'll calm the little shit down. That's just what they did in those days. But in Philadelphia, opium directly correlated to prostitution. And we might as well not call it that. We should just call it what it is, and that's rape. Because that's really what it was. Younger new girls were given the drug to make them drop their guard and perform for their madams. And back in New York, it was the same exact thing. If they couldn't inject it, they would mix it in drinks. And in those days, doctors prescribed it for major problems and minor ones. And like we said, if your child had what we call ADHD today, they'd give them morphine. Women suffering from PMS were given shots of morphine. And all the guys right now are going, man, they ought to bring that back. Right? But they began adding it into cough medicine, such as Dr. Bull's cough syrup and Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. And at the time, there was no law governing the sheer amount of morphine they could add per bottle. So it just transformed people with minor issues to major addictions. And those who became addicts were called, they had a name for it. They didn't call them junkies like we do today. They were called morphinisms. That's what they called that addiction. So in the 1890s, cocaine hits the streets. And while morphine or opium were considered more mellow drugs to calm people down, cocaine made them go fucking batshit crazy. A gang in New York back in the 1890s, the Hudson Dusters, who were a violent street gang who were led by the infamous Red Farrell, said that 90% of the street gangs in New York at that time were cokeheads and were under the influence of cocaine, and they became unstable, dangerous, and were almost unstoppable as bullets, stabbings, and broken limbs could not keep them on the ground. It's like they were possessed and filled with bravery and ferocity. And I guess that means they didn't fuck chickens in the town square. Or maybe they did. Who knows? Any laws on the books were never really enforced. Penalties in jail never deterred anybody from using or selling anything. But, the problem that they were having in those days is it became sort of a circus act. Nobody could agree if it was a legal issue or a medical issue. Heroin then enters the fray, giving junkies options between morphine, opium, cocaine, and now heroin. And heroin was created in 1898 and introduced to the United States by 1901 and was mainly used to treat morphinism, addiction to morphine, which it's trading one fucking addiction for another. Heroin arriving was 3 times as powerful as morphine. And it all got out of hand, and in 1914, the Harrison Act would fail. The 1917 Anti-Narcotic Act would fail. And these acts would just establish using drugs was immoral, but not criminal. The first deaths in Philadelphia related to narcotics go back to just before World War I. Carl Kenlock, known as a drug fiend, shot an innocent woman named Anna Phillips in the chest at point-blank range. Another incident in 1917, a woman shot and killed James Murphy as a result of being dope sick. And nobody knows for sure when exactly the mafia got into narcotic sales, other than to say a small amount here and there. Because nobody knows the exact date. But in those days, people who knew doctors and vets could easily get a steady supply. And so by 1919, according to the U.S. Department of the Treasury, said there was 1 to 4 million addicts in the United States. And it got so bad that in 1920, the Philadelphia police created a narco squad. And it went from use to dealing to smuggling. And the narco squad in Philadelphia could and would arrest those they just merely suspected were on drugs or even had drugs or syringes. Never mind the fact that they could have just been fucking shit-faced drunk. So the first police killing happens in 1919. Patrolman Charles Brendley, was walking on 9th and Christian when he comes across 2 white males who are in the middle of a drug transaction. He approaches one, and one of the men pulls out a burner and points it at the patrolman's stomach. The patrolman, reacting, pulls out his sidearm and shoots the dealer straight in the fucking forehead in front of everybody in broad daylight. And what you may not know is that it wasn't the Italians who cornered the market on drugs to begin with. It was actually the Jewish gangsters in South Philadelphia who cornered the market on that. In fact, the Jewish mobsters formed cocaine trade networks between Maine to New York and Florida before anybody else. In the 1920s, Philadelphia judges and attorneys went after users and would acquire hundreds of convictions. And the state knew that narcotics were being moved and sold by the Jewish mob. And they would find in their investigation that the Jewish mobsters kept tabs on all junkies who went to jail or the nut house. They had their names and dates, their in dates and their out dates, so that as soon as they got out, they could approach them and put them right back on the junk that they were sticking in their veins, up their nose, in their ass, out their prick, whatever it was. And in the mid-1920s, Philadelphia police knew that a major drug distribution center was being run on 8th and Vine and 8th and Christian. And in 1923, Hyman Cohen, a Jewish gangster, and 3 of the Lanzetti brothers were all arrested for dope peddling and running a narcotics syndicate in South Philadelphia. Leo Lanzetti had been previously arrested in 1921 for narcotics offenses. By 1924, the Lanzettis had a system in place. They would head to New York every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to acquire dope. The sheer numbers are staggering. In 1922 alone, 200 drug dealers and 1,000 addicts were convicted in 2 months in Philadelphia. By 1926, it's been estimated that there were 30 to 40,000 addicts living in South Philadelphia alone. And the Lanzetti's base of operation was on the 800 block of Christian Street, and Little Italy was known to officers as Dope Row. According to Harry Riccobene, drugs were not on their radar. Alcohol was, and nobody ever saw drugs as becoming the moneymaker that it would truly become. And according to Riccobene, the problem with the Lanzettis was not only were they selling it, but they were all using it too. Riccobene said that the money was too good, but there was no rule forbidding narcotics selling. And he would take his first pinch at 32 at the age of 22 for doing what? Selling dope. And he would spend the next 2 years cooling his heels in Holmesburg prison. John Avena, for example, was not interested in narcotics. But there were some members who did deal, and the first real boss who was actively engaged in narcotics was Angelo Bruno. The idea that he was against it is total bullshit. The old thought was that, he kept drugs outside of Philadelphia, but he really didn't. However, in the 1930s, when narcotics becomes more mainstream, and guys back in New York were taking drug pinches like Luciano Genovese and Louis Lepke Buckhalter, nobody of consequence in Philadelphia ever got hit with a narcotics charge. Narcotics would become a staple of organized crime a short time later, and Philadelphia could either do one of two things. They could jump into the deep end of the pool, or they could avoid it completely. And we're going to move on to the Jewish Mafia for a bit because Joe Ida and Angelo Bruno learned a lot from them. And this is going to be all-encompassing for when Angelo Bruno takes over. The first real mention of the Jewish mob in Philadelphia takes place in 1912. There would be a very publicized raid in the city's northern Tenderloin, which is now Center City, at parts of Chinatown, and Northern Liberty's neighborhood. And there would finally be proof that the Jewish Mafia was in Philadelphia. Big Sam Levitz, Joe Rosenweig, and Jake Menlenkoff, and Israel Kaufman all get arrested. And they were arrested because they were transporting Gentile women from outside of Pennsylvania into Pennsylvania for the purposes of prostitution. In 1916, the cops made 900 arrests in that same area. And as we said before, Avena liked to work with them, and didn't have, a criminal or political agenda other than simply making money. Angelo Bruno as well would follow the path of Ida and Avena, but keeping those relationships strong. In the 1950s, Angelo Bruno saw and understood the Jewish Mafia had no designs of taking over organized crime, even if by then they had fully taken over Las Vegas, Hollywood, California, and they controlled narcotics and politicians. In those early days, it was only the Lanzettis who worked specifically hand in hand with the Jewish gangsters. And at the 1929 Atlantic City Conference, which we've talked about before on this show, it didn't include Salvatore Sabella. And Sabella didn't send anybody there as a representative of Philadelphia to that meeting. And nobody knows why. And what made the Jewish Mafia so integral to the Italian Mafia was the fact that they could make money everywhere. And they were geniuses when it came to business and earning an illegal dollar. And they could do it without pulling a trigger. And as we said a week ago, Angelo Bruno grew up in a neighborhood that spoke Yiddish in Philadelphia. Bruno spoke Yiddish fluently, which is why all of those decades later, when he became a boss, he remembered the early days and how they were money makers then. And for Bruno, there wasn't really much of a cultural difference between him and them. They were gangsters. They saw green, money. And, the Jewish mob was smart to recognize that the upper, middle, and lower class all wanted essentially the same thing. They wanted drugs, they wanted sex, and they wanted entertainment. And the Jewish mob even moved into areas where Jewish people were not specifically really well liked or wanted. They added bars, nightclubs, dance halls, restaurants. And the Italian Mafia at this point had not yet figured out how to do that. But Angelo Bruno, who grew up with them, saw what they were doing. And the Jewish Mafia also knew how to make a dollar work for them. And they were perhaps the most proficient bribers in the history of organized crime. They owned the cops, they owned the politicians, and believe it or not, the Jewish Mafia was the first group to establish ties overseas to other criminal groups. And the Italians simply copied that decades later. Angelo Bruno, perhaps. And yeah, we're going to go into his full bio next week. I think we'll get to it. But Bruno perhaps never would have become a boss of anything had it not been for the turning of for the sort of tutelage the Jewish mob gave him. Bruno how to work. He just knew how to work with them, and he would do favors for them, lending money to them for low vigs, because the Jewish Mafia had a rule that they never loan sharked. I don't know if any of you know that. They did not believe in loan sharking. And because they didn't believe it religiously, morally, they'd go to Bruno, who'd give them the money. They have no problem taking it from somebody else, even though he's charging a vig, if you understand where I'm going with that. Bruno, in his childhood, in his youth, his younger days, also paid protection for Jewish mobster Fred Cloisterman, who was pulling in over $5,000 a day in the numbers rackets alone. In the 1950s, Bruno would also get into a legit business with Abe Minker, Cappy Hoffman, and Weisberg. And the Jewish gangsters would teach Bruno how to keep his composure, look for legit businesses, and look for ways to make more money from your money. And we're going to stop there. And the reason why I'm doing that is because next week we have the rise of Joe Ida, and then we're on to Angelo Bruno. And these are the days that Bruno is learning and growing. We told you we are going to get, going to get in depth, and that's what we're going to do. The more shows we do on this topic, the more that I sort of see that Philadelphia in so many ways is just a reproduction of a reproduction of a reproduction of events. I mean, we've all seen The Wizard of Oz. The story never changes no matter how many times we fucking watch it. And Philadelphia is the same fucking way. All this is history repeating itself over and over and over and over. And the difference is, after Bruno, in all reality, none of these guys knew how to earn a dime on their own. They became guttural, ghetto bosses with a handout and no business acumen. And so that's where we're going to go with this starting next week. Because let the truth be told, putting my beef aside with anybody, Angelo Bruno was the last decent boss they had there. Everything after that has been chaotic and fucked up. With Nicky Scarfo whacking everybody. Oh, I had a dream. He's snitching. Kill him. That's the type of mentality. And so that's why I always say to you guys, history is repeating itself. And here's what's interesting. Late last weekend, I went on YouTube and I typed in Philadelphia Mafia. And I thought for sure I'd come across 9, 10, 12, 13 different, sort of creators who are talking about the early days in Philly, and not a single person is. And I don't understand that. I don't understand how people say, well, the genre is oversaturated and everybody talks about the same shit. We don't. Because I know I don't. Because most of the stuff that we do, there is some, probably 3% regurgitation out of me. But I just don't understand, because most of what we do here on this show are things nobody ever talks about. Yeah, the obscure gangsters are fun, but the problem is there's not a ton of information out there, and I'm not going to waste my time talking about somebody if I can't talk about them for 2 hours and really give you some stuff that nobody knows. That's just the reality of it. But the mob genre is vast as far as what you can talk about. And that's why I've tried different things, like talking about the cheese wars and some other things like that may not be the most titillating fucking thing in the world, but it gives you another perspective. So that's where we're at with it. That's going to be it for this week. We will see everybody next week back here. Same bat time, same bat station. I am working on a new horror podcast. We will be doing a Mob Talk Radio Live as well at some point. Stay the fuck out of the heat. Jesus Christ, here in New York, it's like fucking melting butter when you walk. It's gross. Who wants to feel that way? Anyway, I hope you guys are enjoying the show. Any questions, comments, concerns, or death threats that you want to levy, you can reach out to us at mobtalkradio@gmail.com. In the meantime, enjoy your work. And yeah, Dean, you're getting this before 1 o'clock today, you prick. There you go. All right, guys. See you later. Show. It's going to be the Philadelphia Mob History Part 6. And like I said, I think legitimately we'll be done next week or the week after. Probably more so the week after. But we're going to jump right into it and... jump into it. So last week we talked about the Jewish Mafia and one of the major belief differences between sort of Sabella, Avena, and Joe Ida. And one of the luxuries that Philadelphia had was little to no fanfare, no press, right? Sabella, would end up getting watched, as did Avena, but it all seemed to escape out of the grasp of the FBI and police. And one of the reasons for that was because the public liked gangsters for the most part. And these are the guys who came along when the Black Hand and the Lanzettis are running fucking berserk. And they handled South Philadelphia in a way that brought thanks and acceptance. However, for all that Philadelphia had somewhat achieved, they seemingly all, every decade, had issues within their own crime family. And that's just history. And the one facet that never changed in Philadelphia was the change in political viewpoints and the change in the lineage. And as I always say on this show, and I think more specifically here, is that the crop or up-and-coming guys, they had a little understanding of what the old world values were. And while each made an effort to change the mob for the better, the reality is there was a big change coming to organized crime in general. And most families outside of Philadelphia would adapt and evolve. But as you're going to see, and as history consistently shows us, that this group has just never been able to completely evolve like other crime families. They have like a stunted growth for some reason. And the other facet to Philadelphia, being able to stay off the government's radar for some 40 years, was because bosses in the hierarchy knew how to bribe, and they knew how to control the police, and they knew how to control the judges. And just for reference, the 17th, the 33rd, and the 37th police precincts, or those districts, were completely paid off and controlled by Pete Cassella. And so we're going to jump a little bit back and forth here for a few minutes just to show you why Philadelphia began to get on the Fed's radar. And then we're going to move all the way into Joe Ida. And it wouldn't be until the 1950s when Philadelphia was the first officially recognized as a national member of the mob. And it doesn't mean that the government or the local government didn't know about its existence. The problem was that they had nothing to substantiate it, legally speaking. And where Philly was just a small enclave of bad Italians versus a nationally recognized criminal organization, the government didn't know. They just didn't know. And what changed all of that was narcotics. And the second that narcotics became the headlines across the United States, things would change for Philadelphia. And a few instances, Joe Ida would be mentioned in the purchasing or distribution of narcotics, which at the time were rumors that were fueled by informants. And that is when the government took stock of the situation. They heard the rumors, and then they would open up a file of Joe Ida in Philadelphia, the first boss they ever opened a file on. But the reality was that a lot of members of the mafia were pushing drugs. But being able to prove that is something else altogether. And this is how the FBI would operate. They hear a rumor, open a file. Or to be more specific, a narcotics file on the subject, and then they would follow up. And we know, going back to the 1930s, Harry Riccobene, Raymond Mortorano, and Frank Sindone were heavily involved in the drug trade and even had state convictions for those types of crimes. The problem on the government's sort of face was that in those days, dope peddling was considered really not the worst of all crimes you could ever be convicted of. And the fact that prison sentences were so small, guys didn't mind risking time for the amount of money that was coming back. And so the feds began to watch Philadelphia, and what they found was a reluctance in the city by police and politicians to do anything about it. They would either bring cases against mob guys, or in other cases, wouldn't even indict them. And Harry Riccobene, to the feds, was a prime example of what was going wrong in Philadelphia. Shortly after Harry Riccobene leaves prison in 1950 for drugs, he gets arrested again on more narcotics charges. Then in 52, another set of drug trafficking charges. And by the mid-1950s, the Ohio federal narcotics agents and the Philadelphia narcotics squad were legitimately fighting over Harry Riccobene. Which one of them is going to go after him? And he gets, picked up in 52 for selling large quantities of heroin. And when you have two institutional sort of government agencies fighting over who's going to go after them, more oftentimes than not, nothing happens. And all of this was a sign to the feds that they had to hammer these guys with bigger sentences and end their murderous ways on the streets. And Riccobene, in that case, loses. He ends up taking a plea deal and gets hammered. And that would lead to J. Edgar Hoover saying that racketeers should be under local authority and be arrested by local police. But behind closed doors, he demanded that his special agents overwhelm the local police and these top hoodlums and ordered them to obtain deep information about his suspects or anybody they suspected, their families, and more, which he wanted to use for his own personal use. And the agents then began amassing tons of information on suspected hoodlums. However, there was no murder that would be attained to federal law. So in other words, in those days, you couldn't get a federal charge for murder. Therefore, hitmen were often bypassed. But not in the case of one guy in Philadelphia, however, and that was a guy by the name of Felix Tutulo, who we know as Skinny Razor. And Skinny Razor was a money-making, killing machine, and he was feared all over Philadelphia, and rightfully so. But there have been some things distorted throughout the history when it comes to Skinny Razor. He's the guy that killed Pius Lanzetti, and everybody knew it. But what was different about Skinny Razor was that, and you're going to love this part, he refused to kick up to any boss. He had his own bookmaking rackets, loan sharking rackets, and more, and he never once kicked up $1 to anybody. He refused, and his reputation ensured that everyone or anyone that got upset with his refusal to pay kept them quiet. Spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you something right now I've never said publicly. And this is going to come to a shock to some of you, but it's the God's honest truth. And here's the little secret. There is a powerhouse right now in South Philadelphia that refuses to kick up a dime to Skinny Merlino and basically told him to go fuck himself. And they've done nothing about it. And that's why I tell you, the more things change, the more things remain the same down in South Philadelphia. Skinny Razor lived a stone's throw away from Marco Reginelli and Dominic Olivetto in Camden, New Jersey. Skinny had a dive bar at an outfit headquarters in South Philadelphia off 8th and Washington called the Friendly Tavern. FBI reports dating back to those days say that the FBI agents were treated like friends whenever they were snooping, and Skinny caught on to them. They would say that he was a mild-mannered, humble gentleman. In another report, when FBI agents went to go visit Skinny Razor, he invited them into his bar and explained to them, I would never do anything against you guys. I never have and I never will. And I never will do anything against the government. And Skinny was always nice and cordial to the feds. And for a good reason. He knew that informants likely told them he was a borderline serial killer and a narcotics user, and that he wanted to push them into his narrative and not the narrative of a rat. However, by 1959, the feds had a lot on Skinny Razor. They knew he was different than others in the streets. He was clean cut, always looked nice, took care of his block, handed out money, and had street smarts. And he was not the prototypical gangster in South Philadelphia at the time. He was not a guttural ghetto egomaniac that many of the South Philly guys were. And the feds knew that Skinny Razor was a bootlegger back in the old days, and they knew he had some dealings with the Lanzettis. And the FBI also knew that Skinny was a vicious murderer, a mob hitman, but he earned a ton of money. And the problem was, with all the information coming from the neighborhood about him, the only thing the government could come up with via charges was narcotics. And they knew, or at least heard, that Skinny smoked opium. So at the suggestion of J. Edgar Hoover, they began to twist that into a narcotics charge. Hoover would send a letter to the agents in Philadelphia asking them to inquire where Skinny was getting his opium from, because based on what they had known, that's the only federal charge that they could even fucking charge him with. And so the FBI then begins documenting deaths that are attributed to gangland killers, and they would document connections between the deceased and the friend's activities. But they failed to distinguish how hitmen like Joe Scafidi and Skinny Razor used different modus operandi when killing. And so all of the mob hits after 1946 were really specifically gruesome. And they could be separated into two types of murder, as indicative of the two main factions that existed in South Philadelphia and New Jersey since its formation. And for example, some bodies were shot and left on the streets. Others were actually mutilated. Bodies were found in the trunk of cars and protected them from the elements, wrapped in blankets tied with cords. And those left in that way were a very ritualistic and symbolic ending, which were meant to be a warning to everybody on the streets. And what people didn't realize is back in the Middle Ages in Western Sicily, this is how things were done. And all they're doing is transcending that into South Philadelphia neighborhoods, like a calling card. So Pete Cassella, or Pietro Cassella, was born in 1907 in St. Louis, Missouri, and his father Sam was a gangster himself. And they came all the way from mob lineage back to Palermo. And when exactly the family arrived in Philadelphia, I'm not sure. But I know that his father got right into criminality in South Philadelphia almost immediately, and Pete Cassella went into the life for himself, and according to the FBI, was a notable killer and terrified a lot of people in South Philadelphia. He had a lot of bodies and nobody wanted to anger him for any fucking reason whatsoever. And according to reports, Cassella was the one guy you went to if you had a problem and needed a violent resolution to that problem. And according to informants and to the FBI files that I do have, Cassella killed at the behest of elder mobsters and in some cases would torture his victims, and in other cases just simply kill them and left them on the streets. And whatever the order was, he fulfilled. And even with those whispers, the feds and police couldn't attach anything to Cassella. His reputation was so fierce that many believed that he was the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia in the 1950s. One informant claimed that Cassella was one of the handful of guys who could order a murder in South Philadelphia. And he'd be right, because by all accounts, Cassella was the underboss at the time. So those rumors might be closer to the truth than anybody ever imagined. He knew Harry Riccobene as well, as the two did murders together at the behest of Salvatore Sabella. They both allegedly took part in the murder of Willie Lanzetti in the 1940s. And so as the mob continued to evolve, Cassella would be associated with Ignazio Denaro and Angelo Scacci Chirico. And according to reports, Cassella was supposed to protect Avena, but Avena was ended up getting killed, as we know. And while Cassella objectively failed at his one job, it's interesting to note that suddenly after the death of Avena, Ignazio Denaro, Angelo Chirico, and Cassella became insanely wealthy because they absorbed the gambling rackets of Avena, which is exactly why Cassella turned his head. We've seen this a dozen times in the mob. Cassella would then go on to form his own huge gambling ring and would completely control the 17th, 33rd, and 37th precincts. He would do the same thing in New Jersey as well. And his turf and territory ended up being larger than Avena's and the Lanzettis combined. And he controlled large parts of North and South Jersey, Camden, Philadelphia, and etc. And he was only on the top hoodlum list because informants told the FBI that Cassella was a killer, an earner, and a made guy within the mob. And he was mentioned in teletypes in California, New York, and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and other places. And the feds tried everything with this guy, but nothing held, and it would wind up being given to the local police to handle it. And so from the feds' perspective, they wanted Cassella bad. They wanted to exploit his vulnerable points. And they knew by weakening his reputation, they could by proxy control what he did. And so the FBI began to hear that Cassella was a notorious drunk. They would hear stories that he was staggering all over South Philadelphia. And there were also rumors that he was busted financially. Stories began to filter out that Cassella was getting into arguments and fights. And it started to make Cassella look bad in the streets and look bad to his mob cronies. And then it would get much worse. The feds had heard a story that Cassella had a thing for young girls, especially one very young girl. He was 50 and she was 14. And the stories of that inflamed the feds. And there was also a story about a hooker who was paid to hook up with Cassella in a homosexual act and take photos. And the FBI may have been behind that attempt to sort of placate it and make up stuff. But all of these stories that the feds began to leak in South Philadelphia added pressure to Cassella. And it began to make him look bad, and it created a real shitstorm personally for Cassella. And as a result, other gangsters began to stay away from Cassella. And he was left to basically fend for himself. And with Cassella down and out, he was a worried guy. He was a paranoid guy. And what did that do? It drove him right into the arms of the FBI, who ended up befriending him in 1957. By the end of 1957, the Philadelphia mob had a lot of issues because Joe Ida had been arrested at the Appalachian meeting. Frank Nicoletti, who was a South Philadelphia loan shark, was the guy responsible for sending up the money to New York at the behest of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia had to kick up money to New York every month because they had to prove that they were a viable part of the national organized crime syndicate. By 1958, the feds would move on Cassella. They would set him up to sell a massive amount of drugs, and eventually Cassella would be arrested for 3 cans of opium, 37 pounds of heroin, valued at $3 million. And the problem for Cassella was that he had borrowed some of the money to purchase this from other mob members, including Angelo Bruno. And when Cassella gets pinched, Bruno could have killed him, and he would have been justified doing so, but he doesn't. The drugs were also financed by Dominic Polina, who was opposite of Bruno and wanted Cassella killed immediately. And Cassella ultimately would be convicted of that and hammered and sent to Atlanta Federal USP. And it would come out years later that the Fed supplied Cassella with underage girls to gain his trust, then to go after him for narcotics. And it shows you the sheer amount of depths that the Feds would go to get somebody. And I brought the Cassella thing up just to show you how things were changing in South Philadelphia. Giuseppe Joe Ida was born on June 14th, 1890 in Fumara de Moro, which was outside of Reggio Calabria. The town was beautiful. There were jobs and things to do, but at the time, the United States was looking for skilled workers. And Joe Ida, who was not married at the time, decided to leave for a better life. And he would leave on October 12th of 1912, leaving from the port of Messina and landing in New York City. He would then head south to Philadelphia. He would end up going to work for Victor Talking Machine Company in Camden, just across the water from Philly. He had some carpentry skills, and he would end up basically working on Ventrola consoles. So in April of 1914, being in the United States for just under 2 years, Joe Ida would file a petition to begin his citizenship proceedings. The problem Ida had was that he didn't have any sponsors in Philadelphia. He was basically a loner and kept to himself. And while Ida had more skills than a lot of other people, because of his background being Italian, he should have been making a lot more money. He should have been making more than other immigrants at that time, but he was Calabrian. And at the time, most Italians were looked at sort of like how Americans look at Mexicans in this country now. Not much is known about Joe Ida in his early days. However, according to reports, he was a good worker, a decent guy, until he got arrested for the first time. And Ida would be arrested just outside of Center City for no reason other than being an Italian immigrant. He was charged with being a suspicious character. And even if those charges got tossed, it was enough to enrage Ida, who had done really nothing wrong at all. And he was mad, he was underpaid, and he wasn't getting anywhere. And at 26 years old, he had a very tough decision to make. A few months later down the line, he would meet and marry Filomena Rizzo. And she was a few years younger, and she was also of Calabrian descent. Within a year of being married, Ida signed up to fight in World War I. Ida would head off to fight, and we would return at the war's end, earning an honorable discharge. And because of that, he was offered immediate citizenship. Being in the military cut through a lot of the red tape of it all, and the rest is kind of history. Joe and his wife would move to South Philadelphia, first on 8th and Federal Streets, and then a bit further south of that. Joe's wife had some family in South Philadelphia, and it's after they moved to South Philadelphia that Joe gets involved in organized crime, and very quickly, and he gets involved in bootlegging, prostitution, and more. His wife was no dummy, and she recognized what her husband was up to, and it became a marriage of money and convenience, really more than anything else. And so his wife would keep busy while Joe was away doing what he needed to do. And Joe Ida's real money in those early days was prostitution. He was linked to Joe Bruno, specifically in the prostitution trade from Trenton to New Brunswick. Bruno and Ida, in fact, controlled and owned a house off Route 130, which was raided by the cops and forced to close due to prostitution. May 30th of 1927, Joe Ida was in Philadelphia, and we know this because we've talked about it a dozen times already when it comes to the hit on Scabby Kokoza and Joe Zangi. Ida was arrested with 3 others, but Anthony Zangi, the brother of Joe, for some reason told the police to let Joe Ida go. And remember, Ida was arrested in the home of Filipina that night. Why he chose to do this, I don't know. But the damage was done because Ida's face and name were printed in the newspaper, which would lead to the government to start keeping track of him. They knew Ida was involved in prostitution, but his name and face plastered on the front page of the newspapers put him in the mafia for the first time. Later in 1927, Ida would be arrested for being a suspicious character and was found to be carried a concealed .38. Antonio Polino, William Dennis, and Joe Ortico would be arrested along with him, and those charges would be dismissed ultimately. But Ida saw the writing on the wall. Philadelphia was too hot, and he needed a place where eyes and ears would be on others and not him. And this made him decide to head to New Jersey, specifically New Brunswick. And at the time, Central Jersey was really just farmlands, empty lots of acres and forests and swamps. And Central Jersey was very important going back to the days of bootlegging because they were mafia dumping grounds for bodies. Whorehouses, alcohol stills were all hidden throughout Central Jersey with a few main roads. There weren't many roads. It offered insulation that Joe Ida wanted. Ida would settle in Highland Park, which is right across the river from New Brunswick. Gambling, as we know it, was spreading out, and Joe Ida took full advantage of that. And he was unlike Joe Bruno in that he didn't splurge or have a degenerate gambling problem. This is a guy that saved his money. He then moves into taking over the numbers rackets in South Jersey, and anybody who thought about interfering would be killed. A lot of people liked Joe Ida, but Riccobene wasn't very fond of him at all. And according to FBI reports, Riccobene's beef was that Ida did nothing to help him escape his prison sentences. In the days when the mob could bribe or make payoffs to ensure a friend didn't go away, Ida did the opposite. He didn't give a shit. It wasn't his problem, wasn't his issue. You want to get caught selling drugs, that's on you. And to Ida, rightfully so, it was really Riccobene's problem to deal with on his own. But because Ida was different than other bosses who would pay off cops, Riccobene had a beef with it. And Ida, to his underlings in South Philadelphia, they badmouthed him. Inferring that he was gay, inferring that during initiation ceremonies he would French kiss the initiates. And it was all bullshit and lies, but it was because Ida kept to himself, kept out of South Philadelphia, and guys want a boss that they can see on the regular. And that's sort of the thing, right? When you're not actively engaged in the streets and you're collecting money from afar, it has a certain look to it. There's a certain jealousy to it. And South Philadelphia was no different in that regard. Being a boss, being a leader, and being unheard and unseen should actually be seen as a strong value to have. But oftentimes, it just works differently. Pettiness is one of sort of the mob's biggest Achilles heels. Joe Ida kept himself scarce, and it helped him avoid petty arguments and politics that were going on in South Philadelphia. And the most important thing that Ida had learned from Joe Bruno is that the ego is cancerous to everybody. Bruno allowed others to be seen as the boss to insulate himself. And Ida learned that from Bruno. Ida himself allows Marco Reginelli to be seen as the boss in the streets and keep to himself, and he keeps the hell away from South Philadelphia. And Riccobene decades later would tell the FBI that Ida was only a boss because of Marco Reginelli. But reality is, Ida was smart. And he allows Marco to be out front, who liked to be seen living the high life, so to speak. And it also confused law enforcement. But Riccobene does have a point. If Reginelli wasn't as tight or as strong as he was, they might have absorbed the family. So in 1946, Joe Ida becomes the official recognized boss of Philadelphia. He kept himself insulated, but the problem was for Ida, when you insulate yourself so much that you allow bookies and loan sharks to go on doing whatever they want, they have to account to nobody for what they're doing. And Reginelli did his job, and he did it well. But he was designed for that specific duty, and he was the official acting underboss for both Joe Bruno and Joe Ida. And it wouldn't be until I think the 1950s when the feds had a better understanding of just how powerful Joe Ida really was. And so while Ida insulates himself, he does meet with Reginelli 3 times a week in Camden to collect the kickbacks from all of the racketeering and stuff they had going on. And once again, though, the problem for Ida missing was Ida missing from the streets. And that gives birth to resentment, jealousy, and it didn't take long because by the 1950s, soldiers and captains within that crime family began to think that perhaps Ida didn't need to be boss. According to Harry Riccobene, there was a coup beginning and that Philadelphia gangsters wanted a street boss, somebody they could see, hear, and listen to, somebody who didn't hide in the shadows. Ida also begins bringing in Calabrians, which infuriated the Sicilian wing of the Philadelphia Mafia, and it made them very suspicious of what Ida's motives are. Once again, we're seeing the Calabrese and the Sicilian thing in action. Street guys wanted to be ensured that Sicilians still had power and that any Calabrian that was brought in would never have an authority over a Sicilian. That's the way they wanted it. It just shows you the own Italian bigotry in South Philadelphia. But it wasn't just there. It was back in New York as well. And in truth, Ida barely was holding on to the reins at that point. And the only thing that kept the family together was the threat of murder. And so Ida begins to make friendships in North Jersey and New York, and Ida was Ida was consolidating his power. Maybe he knew something was brewing back in Philadelphia. I don't know. But with Reginelli out front, he makes himself a target of the feds and the government. Both Camden and Philadelphia police departments had it out for Marco Reginelli, and because Reginelli was mentioned in the Kefauver hearings, it didn't make things any better for him. And this might have added to the simmering temperature when it came to Ida sipping tea in Highland Park and not being really watched at all. Also in those hearings, Angelo Bruno would be mentioned as somebody of interest in several gangland murders. And because of Ida's absence, gangsters in Philadelphia didn't consult with him on murders. They bypassed him and just did whatever the fuck they wanted. And as well, because Ida was not in a visual perspective on the streets, and also in a comedic way, because Philadelphia guys, had no respect for him and just never bothered to mention his name out of disdain. Which also really, it's funny because they don't like him so much that they hate him. They're not going to mention him. But that also enabled Ida to sit at the top with zero interference or eyes from law enforcement. Law enforcement did not know he was the boss. It had also helped that the money showed up into politicians' offices at the local precincts to allow Ida to move around. But most believed that it came from Reginelli, not Ida. It came through Reginelli, but it was really Joe Ida who was paying everybody off. And so the connection rarely got made back to Joe Ida. And that's the God's honest truth of it all. Ida only shows up on radars because of his friendships with William Moretti and Joe Adonis. Both Moretti and Adonis were known in New York and North Jersey as being heavyweights. And Ida being seen with them was enough to land him in the top hoodlum paperwork. And in fact, the paperwork that I have sitting here dates back to 1951. The FBI claimed that Ida was the boss of the Philadelphia, southern New Jersey, and other parts of Pennsylvania like Chester. The problem was the FBI couldn't substantiate any of it. And it's also noted that his friendship with Vito Genovese, and he was actually seen meeting with Genovese in northern New Jersey, where Genovese lived, just outside of Highland Park. And it was more the company that Ida kept that made him a suspect rather than tangible evidence. Also in his files is narcotics trafficking from France to Sicily. And under Ida, narcotics had never been tied publicly to Philadelphia before. The newspapers began running headlines daily about heroin and opium. And it's after Hoover demands that agents find Skinny Razor's supplier that the chain between drug distribution and South Philadelphia comes into focus. Ida takes off to Italy in 1957, right? And he only comes back to the United States after Albert Anastasia and Frank Scalish get killed. And it's shortly after that he ends up going to Appalachian. And believe it or not, he was riding with Dominic Oliveto, Vito Genovese, and Jerry Catania. And they get pulled over essentially at the gate of Joe Barbara's estate. Days later, their names all hit the headlines. And newspapers would print all of the names caught at this meeting, and any insulation that Ida had was gone. Ida would be pulled into Middlesex County to answer questions about Appalachian, and he lied and claimed he was visiting a sick friend. Then he was trying to sell a car. And he actually claimed that he was a car salesman for the DeAngelis brothers going back to the 1940s. And if the feds thought that Ida could, be indicted, they would be wrong because local cops and prosecutors protected him. Once again, it goes back to Hoover saying we want the local guys to handle this, but the problem is the local guys are owned by the mob. And so that is a lot of the reason why everything that J. Edgar Hoover wanted to get done on the local level just wouldn't work. Because when the local politicians and the local cops are paid off, they're not going to indict anybody. And that's what insulated so many bosses, especially in Philadelphia. And that's just the way it sort of worked. And so we're going to stop here for this week. Because next week we're going to go into something that you're going to find out that I don't think anybody has ever heard before. There may have been those that assumed it or maybe thought it. But I've got something that's going to blow your fucking mind. Next week, number one, Ida's about to have more problems because the FBI is pissed that local law enforcement won't do anything more to obtain information about Ida. Excuse me, I read that completely fucking wrong. Number one, Ida is about to have more problems because the FBI is pissed the local law enforcement won't do anything. However, they're going to start obtaining more information about Ida than they thought was possible. They also are going to find out the true reason why the meeting in Appalachian took place and just how many internal problems were festering in South Philadelphia. And a spoiler alert, they're also going to get some information on Lucky Luciano that is going to surprise everybody. It's going to surprise you when I tell you. And it might even answer a long question as to why Luciano never became the successful narcotics trafficker pusher in Italy that he wanted to be. And it's big. And it caught me by surprise when I saw the paperwork and talked to a couple of people I know. Because at first I was like, is this even remotely possible? And there's the FBI paperwork. There's things that they heard, things they picked up on. And then it hits me. Now I understand why Cuba became Cuba. Now I understand why Luciano was so desperate to stay closer to America. And it may not blow your mind. It may not be earth-shattering information. But it's very surprising in a certain kind of way. I think people who don't understand the difference between organized crime in Italy versus the United States are going to be shocked. But I think those that understand the differences in the cultures, the differences in the lineage, the differences between Sicilian, Calabrese, Neapolitan, and et cetera, it's not going to surprise people that understand that. It's big. I think it's big. It makes sense now. Because for a long time I said, why Cuba of all goddamn places? You know, and I understood this front of the sun, 90 miles off the shore of Florida coastline. I get all of that. Okay, they controlled and they bought Batista. I got that too. I totally understood that. So that's the reason why I asked the Luciano and Cuba question. Because I already knew the answer to why Cuba was picked. And the answer really kind of caught me by surprise. And you're going to find out next week. So stay tuned as we continue on next week with Philadelphia. And like I said, I think looking at it, we're probably maybe 2 more shows left in Philadelphia before we're going to move on to some other stuff. But this is a big thing. I can't wait to talk about it next week. And yeah, I could have told you this week, but now I need you to come back. All that being said, we're going to get out of here. Enjoy your weekend. It's supposed to be nice weather. It's not supposed to be like Satan's asshole. And that's a good thing. Keep it dialed in. Reach out to us at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com with all your complaints, threats, whatever you want to do. And all that being said, we'll see everybody here next week. Same time, same bad.